Bar for Bar album reviews. TF, Blame Kansas. Blame Kansas is the latest album from TF and the first one since he signed to Flea Lord's label, Lord Mobb. This album is named after the street he grew up on in South Central Los Angeles and features production in the first half from Mephux and the back half from Roc Marciano. The production is definitely a highlight, and given that he's signed to Flea Lord's label and he's done work with Griselda, it's not too surprising and kind of what you would expect, but given his previous works, it is a bit of a departure. But that's not a bad thing at all. I think it's pretty solid. The project starts off really strong with the intro/title track, Blame Kansas, which begins with a little news snippet basically saying all this violence and all these deaths are likely due to just regular, everyday arguments. It almost sounds like it was downplaying it a little bit, but at the end of the day, that's a big reason for a lot of things happening, I guess. But this intro really sets the tone for the project and gives you a bit of a glimpse of TF and where he comes from. And this is kind of a theme that we get throughout the project. Not the news snippets, but little glimpses of TF. This intro is then followed by my favorite track, Olathe, featuring Conway the Machine and Roc Marciano. Everything from the production to just the cadence of TF's verse, it's so good. It's just really solid. He just slides over the beat. And, of course, Conway and Roc do their thing too. As we go through the rest of the first half, we get to know TF a bit more, and like I mentioned, it's kind of sprinkled throughout. It's not like he's going to just straight up say what happened all the time, but he'll kind of mention it anecdotally, which I guess you could argue isn't everyone's favorite way, but it's different from some other projects we've heard where the artist is just like, no, this is what happened, and they just tell you the whole story. I kind of like the mystery, if that makes sense. The intermission track, which is exactly halfway through, is really solid too. This is the final track from Mephux on the production, and it marks the transition to Roc Marciano's production. Other than it being literally an intermission, halfway through, also is you can kind of relate that to being an intermission in his life, which is kind of what he talks about through his project, or at least on that track. It's talking about all the things that he did in between, the music and other stuff in life. Just living his life sort of thing. Once we get to Friend of God with Crime Apple, we get production that's very Roc Marciano, which again may sound negative, but if you've listened to production from him before, you can kind of identify the sound. But it's still solid. And honestly, at first I thought it was going to be a bit jarring to switch producers like that, halfway through the project, but it worked pretty well, I'd say. Through the second half of the album, we get really solid production, and it's going more towards just other things he's done in life, which not a bad thing. Trying to get you get to learn a little bit more about him through tracks like Betty Crocker and Long Way Home. Speaking of Long Way Home, as the album really begins to close out, Long Way Home does a good job of wrapping things up. And honestly, I feel like if Fuck the Rest wasn't on here, it would still be a really solid outro. Because one, the production kind of winds down and it's more, I guess mellow is the right word for it. But it also just kind of ties up loose ends. It's a really good way to close out the album. Now, that's not to say that Fuck the Rest isn't a good closer for the album, but I will say it is a bit jarring to go from something that kind of slowly closes out to just horns all of a sudden. But also on that track, I think my biggest issue is the way that Flea Lord's doing the chorus, because he's just yelling "Fuck the Rest," and it goes on a little bit too long for me. And there's been so many times where I'm driving around listening to it, and I'm like, man, he's still going. All right. Because, you know, weather's been weird recently, and the other day I had my windows down, and I'm like, damn, I can't really, I mean, outside of the song just saying fuck the rest and driving through residential areas, it's kind of weird. Like, people will be like, why are you just yelling fuck the rest out your car? But still, not a bad way to close out the album. Overall, this album was pretty solid. This was really my first time listening to TF in an album context. I have listened to him as a featured artist at times, and while writing this review and recording this, I went back and kind of just listened to a couple tracks from him just to see if this is the sound that he's done in the past. And it's weird. Like, this production style isn't really the sound that he's done, at least not recently. So to me, it's interesting that he switched it up. But again, I'm not mad at it. I mean, rappers switch up their style all the time, and sometimes it works really well. This is probably one of those times. To be fair, I think with whatever comes next, we'll get a better idea of if this is actually the direction that he's going in the future. But I also wouldn't be opposed to some of the production that he did in the past. But I think what differentiates him with this is that he's from the West Coast, but he's rapping on more East Coast style beats. Whereas before, people could kind of box him in, and he's like, oh, okay, he's just an LA rapper. Like, I get that. Even though the subject matter may be different, you know? Like, even his, like, the way he raps, like his flow, his cadence, like, it doesn't necessarily sound like typical LA sound. So, I mean, I get it, but yeah. My favorite tracks on this album are Olathe, Death Wish, Friend of God, and A Long Way Home. But yeah, this album was pretty solid. Like I mentioned earlier, having two different producers at first was a bit concerning because, you know, you don't know how their production styles may have meshed. Thankfully, they did mesh pretty well, and given that they were on basically two halves of the album, it provided for essentially two different listening experiences, but also one at the same time, because like I mentioned, the transition was pretty solid. Like, it wasn't jarring by any means. I am looking forward to whatever TF does in the future, whether it's continuing with this sort of, I guess, more East Coast / Griselda sounding production, or if he's going to go back to something that sounds more West Coast. Either way, I'm excited and definitely interested in seeing what happens in the future. But that's all I have for this review. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of this album and if you've listened to TF in the past. Also, like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Thank you for watching, and please stay safe out there.